welcome to this week's episode of the Frenzied Book Lovers podcast. Now, this week I've got for you not one, but two book reviews. Both these books are based on movies and they lie on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So the first book is on a movie from parallel cinema. The second book is pure Bollywood masala. Let's get started. First up is Jai Arjun Singh's JAANE BHI DO YAARON, seriously funny since 1983. Now, most millennials will swear by this movie. It was a cult classic directed by Kundan Shah. It had a stellar star cast, but a very, very simple plot. I'll quickly take you through the plot before we get into why this book is such a gem. The plot of the film is fairly simple. It's about two struggling photographers in Bombay, Vinod and Sudhir, who are extremely earnest and want to make an honest living. Now, they are approached by the editor of a magazine called Khabardar to investigate and dig up some dirt on the corruption that's going on between the commissioner in the city and some builders. Now, while they're doing this, they also decide to participate in a photography competition and they go to a garden to click some pictures. While they're at it, they accidentally click pictures of this Commissioner de Mello, played by Satish Shah, being murdered and therefore hold this crucial evidence. What they don't have is the corpse, which then transports itself from one caretaker to another in a coffin, sometimes wearing a sari, sometimes in a Mahabharat scene, etc. through the course of the film. The film has a stellar star cast. Apart from Nasir and Ravi Vaswani, it has Om Puri, who is cast in an unusually funny role as the extremely drunk builder called Ahuja. There are several things that stand out in the film and in the book. So, for instance, a film that was made on the nexus between media, politicians, bureaucrats, builders, or the business community was actually funded by the NFTC. Made on a measly budget of under 7 lakh rupees, what makes this film so fun and interesting is that the entire cast got together and made it a success. Special mention for editor Renu Saluja, whose responsibility it was to keep the film super tight and to keep the narrative on track. In fact, when you go through the book, you also realize that some of the funnest scenes had to be cut out because they had to stick to a time duration. So, for instance, Anupam Kher was cast as a villainous disco killer. His part was eventually chopped off, but you can't help but think about him as the forefather of crime master Gogo. Finally, I think it's very hard to write about the making of a satirical film. You can't help but mention the jokes and you know that it'll be hard for them to land. And I also wish there was an extra DVD edition, if I may call it that, but I wish there was an extra edition where we could have all the deleted scenes, but I'm afraid that is not to be. Now, next up, you can see Amitabh Bachchan, poster version, burst through this book cover that is based on the life and works of Salim-Javed. This book has been written by Diptakirti Chaudhuri, who calls himself a salesman by day and a writer by night. Now, for those of you who may not know this, Salim and Javed are essentially Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar. Salim Khan is the father of Salman Khan, and Javed Akhtar is father to Zoya Akhtar and Farhan Akhtar. So Salim came to Bombay to become an actor. He had the flair, he had the style, and he wanted to act, but he only could land a couple of roles before turning into writing. Javed Akhtar, meanwhile, started off as a clapper boy on a film set. When the two of them united, they were unbeatable. They had the knack for storytelling and how, in fact, directors who liked sitting through 2 or 3 hours of narration would be convinced listening to them in the first 5 minutes. This book by Diptakirti Chaudhuri essentially talks about Salim-Javed and how they changed the face of Indian cinema by bringing screenwriters from the back rooms to the opening credits of films. Screenwriters in the 70s had a tough life. Now, they didn't get a lot of the recognition that they deserved, and some of them were essentially cast in the shadows. The people who got all the adulation were actors, directors, and even music composers. Now, Salim-Javed not only challenged but changed that. Salim-Javed were also supremely aggressive. They promoted themselves really well. They even paid trade magazines from their own pockets so that they could be written about. This book by Diptakirti Chaudhuri essentially takes you through each of the films that Salim-Javed worked on. And Diptakirti Chaudhuri also realized that they worked on a formula. So they would essentially pick up an old film with an old plot that had already been made. Then they would pack it up with some, contemporary social context, some really punchy dialogue, some great sequences, and boom, you had a hit right there. You cannot have a book about Salim-Javed and not talk about Sholay. Now, Sholay was by no means original. Salim-Javed were extremely inspired by Kurosawa, by John Sturges. In fact, there was a movie that came out before called Mera Gaon Mera Desh that had the character Jabbar Singh ahead of Gabbar Singh later. Apart from this, one can't take away from the fact that Salim-Javed were extremely hands-on. They would travel from location to location, from set to set. So the two were basically involved in all aspects of filmmaking, including casting choices. So it was in their hands how some of the careers of these massive stars in the 1970s shaped up. The book ends on a somber note as Salim-Javed decide to part ways. Now, it's not a happy parting. In fact, it seems Salim Khan's version of the story is that it was Javed Akhtar, in fact, who decided to call it quits with him and decided to follow his own career path. And that left a lot of bitterness in them. The relationship has now come a long way and they appear to be cordial. Why did I enjoy reading this book so much? So for one, I really did appreciate the fact that Salim-Javed, they were not original. They were by no means pioneers, but they did manage to bring that one aspect of filmmaking to the front. They got the spotlight on writers, and I'm glad they did that. There's another anecdote I recall where Amitabh Bachchan and Sanjeev Kumar vied for the role of Gabbar Singh. They were very, very keen to play it. That eventually went to Amjad Khan. And that's extraordinary, right? Because these were two actors who were used to playing protagonists with no dark shades. Now, I will end this podcast by saying that while I really enjoyed, reading these two books and bringing them to you, I couldn't help but wonder if there's any documented work, if there are any larger pieces on cinema from various different parts of the country. And it would be great if you could drop in a comment, send a carrier pigeon, slide in a DM to let me know if you've come across any interesting works from different parts of the country, on the movies made in different parts of the country. That would make for a good read. Thank you for watching.